Welcome to Memory Safe. This is Lindsay O'Donnell Welch with Decipher, and I am very excited to be joined today by Phil Venables. Phil, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so Phil, I don't know how much of an introduction you actually need because you're so well respected and known in the infosec industry. But Phil has been the CISO at Google Cloud since 2020, and before that, he spent over 25 years at different financial services companies. So he has really a wealth of knowledge, not just about financial services and security there, but also security from a CISO perspective and understanding the top security threats and risks that organizations face. So, Phil, how are you doing today before we get started here?
All good. It's never a dull moment in cybersecurity, but it's all good at the moment.
Yep, yep. It's always keeps us on our toes. So I can definitely, I know what you mean. So great. Well, during Memory Safe, this podcast series, we ask the same 10 questions to all of our guests on the show. And we like to cover everything from really, how you got into cybersecurity to kind of what you're seeing in your day-to-day role. So I'll start with the first question here. Question number one is, when did you get your first computer?
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, I'm not on the young end of things anymore. So I got my first computer in 1981, which was what they call it was called Commodore VIC 20. It was the predecessor of the more famous Commodore 64. So, for people that don't know it, this was like 3.5K, not meg or gig, K of RAM, and it just ran basic, and that was my first home computer.
Nice. Yeah. How was your kind of experience there? Like, and what
It
were
was
you?
all good. This is again when there was not that much. There was really kind of no online. You had to self teach yourself this stuff. You did it from the handbooks. You maybe did it on some kind of after school clubs and other things. But like most people of my generation, we're all kind of self taught, and because this was before much of this was actually taught. So it was a good experience.
And then on kind of going from there, when did you first go online?
Yeah, again, this is, I hope this is not a theme. This might be like a computer history lesson. And as we're talking today, it was really in the kind of late 1970s, actually, from a school computer. I was lucky to go to a school that was kind of into some of these things. And we had a local university that was quite a well-regarded technical university. So we had a school computer that you could, went on a dial-up connection to the local university. And this is kind of sufficiently old. It wasn't even like a modem that you plug in the wall. This was where you'd seen this on like movies where you got the phone handset and you'd stick it in these two kind of pads, and that's the way it connects to the computer. But the kind of the first kind of real internet online was in the late 1980s, when late 80s early 90s, when I was at university, and we were using kind of Telnet, SMTP email, FTP, and some services that maybe some of your listeners will have heard of. Things called WAIS, WAIS, Wide Area Information Service, another thing called Gopher, and these were like the way you searched for information before the World Wide Web. And so again, all of this was pre 94, which was when the World Wide Web started. So that was at university when I was on the internet. I think I got my first internet, my SMTP email in like 1986, which I don't have access to. I often think I'd love to go back and see what emails I was writing then, but I don't have access to it anymore.
They need to make like a history type of thing for, so you can go back and access all of, your first email or like your first, something or another. So
Yep. Yep.
that's really cool. Was it like an eye-opening moment where you were like, this is really interesting, or were you kind of just doing it functionally
No,
for school?
it's funny. I kind of it's an interesting question, because when I look back and I think maybe I should have been more excited about this stuff, and actually it was just like routine. It was just, oh, I'm now on a computer. Oh, now I can talk to other people. And now I can search data. Now I can email my professor, and then email somebody he told me to talk to at like some other university. And I think interestingly, what people might forget is I also you know, did work in parallel with university, and and I worked for various companies developing software and doing systems programming, and and everybody in IT had email. It just wasn't
Yeah.
like internet email. You could email each other, you could do all sorts of different stuff. Maybe a podcast for another day. I used to be an IBM mainframe systems programmer at a company in parallel with what I did at university, and and we had like the IBM mainframes. Back in the 80s, you could run this thing called SGML, which is the predecessor of XML and HTML,
Hmm.
graphic markup language. They had a whole array of technology, and and so this was,
Yeah.
the internet was kind of not that too unfamiliar compared to what people were using in enterprise at the time. Now, of course, the World Wide Web and the explosion of everything since then has been dramatically different. But in the
Right.
early days, it was just like another thing. Not, it kind of crept up on us how it was, the dramatic changes that occurred.
It is crazy just to kind of see how that changed over time and how it continues to change too. It's just like you just really feel like you're part of something that's bigger really than your everyday life in terms of kind of how that's evolving. All right, so question 3, which is a little different, but it kind of leads into that a little bit. But what was your first exposure to hacker culture?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really remember, to be honest. I mean, I just know in the late 80s and early 90s, being in the middle of dealing with some of the early computer viruses, the early kind of Windows Office macro viruses. I remember seeing some of the first, Word macro viruses. That certainly was in and around dealing with some of the early criminal and nation state intrusions, even back then, in the 90s. And then, of course, there was things like some of the big early internet events, like the Morris worm. Again, some of your listeners may not have heard of this. Definitely encourage people to Google that. I think that was kind of 1988, when Robert Morris, who was actually the son of one of the senior national security agency people at the time, which was kind of embarrassing for everybody, just
Yeah.
created an experiment that essentially took the early internet down. It was a pervasive worm that hit the internet, and this was, I think, 1998. So I remember seeing and watching and looking at all that kind of stuff. So and then as the 90s progressed, we were always involved in various different things. But I just remember the early viruses, the early worms, and some of the early criminal and nation state intrusions into government and banking systems and telecommunication systems. So this is it feels like there's a lot of stuff new, and certainly the scale of what we deal with today and the
Mm.
scale of the attack surface is very different. But ultimately, when you look at attacks and you look at what's going on, nothing's ever new. It's been going on for decades. Yeah.
Right, right. And I'm so curious when all of those things were playing out, like what was, when you look at like family or friends, like it seemed like that probably was a little different from their reaction to those types of things versus now where, you're seeing cyber attacks on like Good Morning America or something.
That's right.
Yeah, like how was that kind of playing out just from what your perspective was?
Yeah, I mean, I think there wasn't a lot of media coverage on any of this stuff. It was kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know if you've read the book The Cuckoo's Egg by Clifford Stoll, which is
Hmm.
the classic book of how he tracked down some, I think they were East German spies who were kind of breaking into American defense networks. I mean, that's the classic story. I mean, it was. When that was published, didn't get a lot of attention. It's
Yeah.
I'm surprised nobody's made a movie out of that yet, but maybe they haven't. I've just not seen it. Right.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good point, though. I mean, it's like it's interesting how it's kind of emerged more into just normal lives as opposed to kind of before where it was a little more siloed and separated. Okay, next question here is when did you think you might make this a career? We've talked a little bit about, when you started to use technology and kind of had heard of different things happening, but, I really want to know about your own experience.
Yeah, so like I didn't. is the
Yeah,
short answer.
I
So
hear that a lot.
my
Yeah.
entire career is just an accident. So I started out as a software engineer. I mean, I was like a software engineer, a systems programmer,
Mhm.
building, applications in defense, energy, infrastructure, financial systems. And I kind of stumbled into building security software. Before you could really buy it. So I developed a bunch of cryptographic software for some European banking payment systems. I developed some firewalls before you could really buy them. I developed some intrusion detection systems before you could really kind of buy them. And so I kind of ended up coming at security as a software engineer, and then gradually stayed in security as a big progressively kind of leading teams and building security programs. And I think it's not that long ago since I stopped thinking of myself as a software engineer and thought, I'm never going to get for the first decade of doing security. I always thought I'm going to go back to doing a software engineering job, and I never managed to escape. So I think I'm not complaining. I've had tremendous fun doing what I'm doing, but
Yeah.
my plan was never to do this. My plan was to be a software engineer, to do software engineering stuff in various different industries, and I got captured by security and by by building software for security. And I think it's interesting, actually. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, that security has come full circle. So, like the early days of security, most people were engineers building security software because you had no choice, because you couldn't really buy stuff. And
Mhm.
then it progressed into being this kind of audit, risk management kind of discipline where everybody was doing risk assessments and filling out checklists. And now,
Right.
thankfully, it's kind of come full circle again, where most leading security programs are very engineering centric,
Mhm.
and they, integrate or develop or buy tooling to give to their colleagues in the software development teams or the product development teams. And so it's interesting now, it's kind of come full circle that most world class security programs, not
Mhm.
to diminish the fact that it's important to do all the risk management stuff, but most world class security programs are actually quite engineering centric and about providing solutions and building security into the platforms rather than kind of bolting it on afterwards.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and it must have been really interesting to see that, especially from a financial services perspective, where it is such a big compliance checklist, sector, and how that's played out to when it comes to there. So, I think that's a really good point, and you mentioned too, like I'm curious too, like when you say it, it happened by accident, how did you kind of fall specifically into the CISO role? Because I hear a lot of CISOs say that they were kind of voluntold to do it, or it wasn't necessarily a role that was in place when they arrived. Would love
Yeah,
to hear
yeah.
your own experience.
No, it's interesting because I think I think I first became a CISO when I think I was like 26. I had almost no experience or qualifications to do the job I was doing, and we were all figuring out and learning it at the time. We didn't call it CISO then. I think my title was like Global Head of Technology Risk Management or something.
Yeah.
Um, and the interesting thing about all of that is you start off by developing software, and then then you start taking on more management, and you start thinking about other issues of like network security, infrastructure security, software
Mhm.
security. Then you gradually accumulate responsibilities for kind of compliance and risk and all of these other things, and you just kind of grow with it. And at some level, I kind of think, for people who are aspiring to be CISOs, there's there's a lot of learning and a lot of training and a lot of structured ways to take on that role compared to what it was in the past. But on the flip side, people in my generation, I think, have potentially had it easy because we just kind of rode the wave and learned as we were going along and never had to navigate this. It was just all kind of like you just kind of accumulated the experience over time. But no, it was every one of my earlier roles in security were just this extra thing I was going to do before I got back to doing software engineering, and then at some point you just realize, no, you're the security guy from now on, and
Yeah.
that was it. So.
I love that. You just look around and you're like, I guess this is it. It's big. Okay, well, and for question 5, this is kind of an interesting one and follows up on that last one. But what was your alternate career idea? And I feel like maybe you might have just addressed it, but was there
Y-
something
y-
else that?
Yeah, like the security is my alternate career. But which is a bit no, no, actually, in all seriousness, I mean, there's a few roles I had at the early stage, and one of my early jobs, I worked for a British defense contractor developing various software for submarine warfare and submarine and sonar guidance systems and sonar targeting systems and other things, and
Wow.
so I was kind of when you sometimes look back and think, what was the other road that you could have traveled, I kind of quite enjoyed the sectors of industry where you're building software that controls machinery. And
Mhm.
I did also some work for the British coal mining industry, and I did some work for an American oil company on process control on North Sea oil rigs. And so I kind
Wow.
of enjoyed building software that like moved big pieces of machinery around and
Yeah.
or like had physical world consequences. So I kind of I stayed with doing security mostly in financial services, but I think there was always kind of the alternate possibility of going back to more hardcore software engineering in those kind of process control physical industries, which is always kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it must be like fascinating now in the past, like, 3 to 5 years to watch all the critical infrastructure, kind of news that's played out and how security and industrial, security are kind of,
No, no, I mean, it's interesting because everybody thinks that's new.
yeah,
Again, there's really nothing really new. This was
right.
all happening years ago. It's
Yeah.
just it wasn't kind of internet connected per se, but it was certainly a lot of quite interesting stuff has been network connected for a long time, and people think about um, um, attackers attacking physical infrastructure in industrial control systems.
Hmm.
Um, being something new because those things may happen now to be internet connected. But again, back in the day, there was plenty of examples of attackers breaking into industrial control systems through dial-up modems, and just again, some of the listeners may be familiar with the phrase war dialing,
Hmm.
which was where attackers would literally just have an automated system to dial a whole range of phone numbers and trying to hear a modem signal come back, and they'd file that for later use, and then they'd go and try and connect into that system, and lo and behold, sometimes that system was like a power plant or a an air traffic control system. It was a less speedy and lower tech way of connecting into industrial control systems, but industrial
Right.
control systems have always kind of been connected because people need to go and remotely manage them, whether it's directly or over the internet. So yeah, it's you get sufficiently old in this game, and nothing is really that new. It's just a different expression of the same thing on the new technology.
Right. That's so it's a different kind of way of doing something that has been done over the years. Yeah, that's a good point. All right, question 6. Let's move along here. Who was, or I guess is, your hacker hero?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily pick on the phrase hacker hero, but I have a lot of people in the industry that I look up to and have learned a lot from, and it's hard to pick one name, but I will pick one name, and that's Dan Gear. So again, Dan is just is probably the person that's most shaped my thinking in this space for decades. And I'd encourage everybody to just Google everything Dan has ever written and read it carefully, and then reread it, because there's a lot of depth and subtlety in it. For those of you who don't know Dan was, there's done many things, but his first, I think, kind of entry into security was with Project Athena at MIT, which begat the Kerberos protocol and software, which to this day is pretty pervasive about how we authenticate both kind of human and system identities across large parts of our infrastructure. And and that was Project Athena that came up with that. I mean, Dan's done many things. He's still CISO at InQtel, which is the US intelligence community venture capital arm. And I have the privilege of working with Dan today on. He's part of a President's Council of Advisors Science and Technology Working Group that I'm co-chairing on cyber physical resilience, and it's a real
Mhm.
pleasure to have Dan as part of that working group with us. So yeah, he's just like genius level on these things, and he's certainly shaped my thinking in the space for the longest time.
Yeah, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And there's the thing I love about the cybersecurity industry is there's just so many super smart people who not only know everything things about technology and cybersecurity, but then really how you can kind of how different trends are evolving and how we can really kind of you know make scalable different types of security solutions. Um, so let's look at the next question here. This one I'm always curious about. What is your favorite hacker movie?
Yeah, so my favorite one, again, this is maybe a generation thing, is War Games. The
Mhm.
Matthew
Yeah,
Broderick movie, which again, I talked about kind of war dialing earlier. That was a kind of great example of
yeah,
him war dialing and finding this kind of defense computer to connect to. But it was interesting, if people haven't seen it or have seen it, they should probably watch it again, because it's got a bunch of AI lessons in it as well, which are kind of obviously very topical. But no, that's
yeah.
a great movie that I occasionally rewatch.
That's a classic. That's a good one. um, all right, question 8. How do you describe your job, your current role?
Yeah, it's funny. It's a good question, and I can see why you have this question on the list, because we all struggle with this. I mean, my wife tells people I'm a security guard, and like worryingly, most people believe her, as if like I'm physically guarding something. So, but no, in all seriousness, the way I kind of describe my job is it's really about how do we enable people to get on with their digital lives in safe, secure, and private ways.
Mhm.
It really is about, as society is digitizing. It's probably nearly fully digitized, but there's a lot still left to do still, and as we all are essentially conducting our lives online, whether it's our business, our public life, our private life, it's all somehow digitized and connected, and making sure
Yeah.
that's safe, secure, and private is, I think, is a noble mission for all of us that work in security.
Yeah, it's so I feel like it's difficult because it's such a big task, I guess. There's just so much that goes into it, and I would love to know more about kind of how you are trying to like tackle that on a day to day role, or
Yeah.
how you
Well, it's
even
interesting.
approach that.
It's all about. I mean, this is kind of a cliche because it's true. Is that cybersecurity is a team sport. And this
Mhm.
is not just a team across the industry of companies working with each other, but teams within an organization. So again, at Google, we have so many teams and so many thousands of people that are focused on, protecting our users of all the Google services, and then protecting our customers on Google Cloud so they can protect all of the users of their products and services.
Mhm.
And this is a big kind of team effort of security, privacy, compliance, trust, and safety, partnering with our lawyers and ethicists, and just all of the engineers that build products have their main priorities thinking about the security, privacy, and trust of our users. And everybody takes it very seriously, the responsibility we have, that we're protecting billions of people every single day. And again, it's one of those kind of awesome missions, that people really find challenging and focus constantly on doing the right thing. And I don't think any of us in the security team think it's not all on us. It's like it's a combined team effort. And what's great now is, as you see across the industry, it's such a team effort
Yeah.
among companies that, on one thing they may be fiercely competing with each other, but when it comes to security and defending the internet and defending our critical infrastructure and defending people's privacy and security, then all the companies come together and figure out ways to do that as a team.
It's so true. Like it's not just one person is going to be, able to kind of wave their wand and be like everything is going to be okay. Like you need to work together and it's great that, you can work together with all those different teams and people, but in a sense that might be a little challenging too, just to be able to kind of build and maintain and develop those relationships, whether it is with kind of engineers or like different aspects of the organization, like HR, like, legal, just all there's so much there.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. All right. Question 9 is what was your biggest mistake? And then on the flip side, what was your proudest moment?
Yeah, I mean, like, anybody who's been doing this a long time has a collection of mistakes. So this could be a whole a whole podcast in itself. But probably the one that stands in my mind the most was when I was fairly young, and again I was a mainframe system programmer, and I basically I typed in a command on the wrong screen. There's this command called IPL, which stands for Initial Program Load. It's basically how you reboot a mainframe, and I typed this on the wrong command. And this is an illustration of like decades ago when there was really no guardrails on a lot of systems, and an operator or a systems programmer typing in the wrong command. There was no kind of "Are you sure?" It was just "Sure." You're the boss. When I rebooted an entire mainframe, which took out the entire company for an hour. So
Oh God.
I never ever did that again, and I'm always now really careful and always careful to make sure whatever systems I built subsequently have multiple guardrails and checks, and limit the blast radius of potential operator or user error. So it was a good thing that happened to me,
Yeah.
very early on. In terms of kind of like proudest moments, again, I think, when I look back, the best thing is just looking at the people that, that have been in my teams, that, I hope I had kind of some part in their professional development, but, most of it's, kudos to them that have gone on to become CISOs in their own right. And, when I look back over the many teams in many organizations I've run, there's just so many people that started as a college graduate or an intern, and they're now CISOs of major companies. And when you just
Mhm.
look at that, it's you can't help but be proud of their achievements. I kind of, one of the things I've kind of talked about in other venues. I actually think we should have like a CISO kind of parent and grandparent and index, which is because I'm now just as of I think as of a couple of years ago, so I've got a bunch of people that worked for me that are now CISOs, and then a bunch of people that have worked for them are now CISOs. So like you have this kind of genealogy of kind of can you kind of how much have you contributed by helping create the community of CISOs. So again, I look back the proudest things, and when I see people who've worked for me go on to do like amazing things, and that's just really great.
Yeah, I love that. That's got to be a great feeling. And it is funny, like, I've talked to a bunch of CISOs, and, like, everyone kind of has their own way of approaching an issue or doing things. And so it must be cool to, look at other people that, you've trained or, influenced over the years and kind of see that, you know, play out or have their own spin on that as well. Um, so that's really cool. All right. And here's our last question, question number 10. What is your best piece of security advice?
Well, I'll split it into two. So, like, there's the enterprise advice and the personal advice. So, for enterprises, I mean, I'm kind of talking our own game here, but it's all about striving for secure products, not just security products. And I've been talking about this for years, which is, if unless we're getting to the point where all products are intrinsically secure, then we're gonna lose. And so having security built in, not bolted on after the fact, is just like mission number one, I think, for everybody. And I think all enterprises need to think about that.
Mhm.
On a personal level, the main advice I always give people is just figure out how to kind of adopt stronger authentication in all of the services you use, whether it's like a Google security key or another kind of authenticator app, or even kind of SMS codes are like better than nothing
Yeah.
or better than passwords. But having stronger and stronger forms of authentication, still, I think, as most people know, most issues out there ultimately come down to kind of an authentication issue in some way. And the other one is just follow the advice and stick to the secure defaults you're kind of the services are giving you. I mean, again, I can only really speak for Google. I mean, we spend a lot of time across all of the services like Gmail and all of the other things that we do, trying to figure out how to make the defaults as secure as possible.
Hmm.
And so, using, not changing those defaults when companies like us have spent a lot of time figuring out how to make the defaults secure is often the best advice. But using the strong authentication and accepting the strong security defaults you may be offered by services, I think is always the best advice.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think that's a really important piece to highlight, that latter advice about for, specifically for personal or consumers is, sometimes I feel like in the cybersecurity industry, it's easy to get wrapped up in kind of the technical terms and, what we all know in the industry. But when you're talking to people outside of the industry, like it's really important to be able to relate to them and to make their experience seamless as well. So I think that's good to highlight for sure. Um, all right, well, Phil, thank you so much for joining me today. It was really great to talk to you and learn more about you and kind of your experience in the industry.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for doing this. I think it's a really interesting take on how to get people like me and others in the profession talking about these things. It's great.
Awesome. Thanks so much.